Hi everybody, thanks for having me. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but I hope that this recorded panel will work as well. Today we will talk about Mesozoic Art II and one of the specific aspects of my work that I think that could provide some food for thought for my fellow paleoartists and my fellow paleoenthusiasts present today. I want to thank Karim for having me and for this amazing virtual exhibition, and Darren Naish and Steve White for the incredible work in the publication of Mesozoic Art II. But first, before starting with this panel, let me introduce myself. Hi, I am 𝗦𝗶𝗺𝗪. Some of you might know me already. I'm a natural history illustrator, which means that my job is to create illustrations and artworks that explain to a wide audience some of the topics of the scientific research in the field of both extinct and living organisms. Here you can find a bit of my resume. In the center there are my independent publications, the books and the pamphlets that I published from 2019 up to now. At the right instead you can see me during workshops teaching paleoart and paleontological reconstruction at some universities and some schools. And below you can find some of my selected clients, basically in the museum field, publishing companies and science communication. Here is a brief section showing some of the awards I have received in wildlife illustration and paleoart competitions since the beginning of my career. And here are the cover and the artists featured in Mesozoic Art II. I'm so happy and honored to be part of such a talented group. For those who will purchase the book, you will find a great example of how diverse the discipline of paleoart can be. You will see more graphic and pop style illustrators, as well as some comic artists. Some of these artists are paleontologists and others are natural history illustrators like me, specializing in both living and extinct animals. Why am I mentioning diversity? Because the diversity of paleoart and its variations is a topic that we will explore later on. And here is a little preview of what you will find in my chapter. Some of the paintings featured are already known, but I have created 3 new paintings, like the one blurred on the top right corner, that are unpublished. I will not share these paintings, at least for now, because I want the first customers to have the joy of the surprise. As we delve in my portfolio, we can start to see a bit of the diversity I mentioned before. I'm a self-taught artist. Everything that I know about natural history, illustration and art is the fruit of my personal studies since my young age. This means that I have never had a trainer that could teach me and sometimes impose me a particular style. So I had the freedom to explore a large quantity of styles and visual languages, making them mine. Scrolling this section of my portfolio, we have seen some more vintage and classic scientific illustrations, as well as digital engravings in black and white, as well as vibrant and realistic paintings. Every one of these specific tables with its style has been crafted for a specific purpose, and the style is part of that purpose. Here, for example, we can see some applications of the different style I used for different products. Vintage scientific illustration can be especially appreciated in mainstream contexts like certain magazines, creating an interesting contrast between the modern look of the magazine's graphic and the old-fashioned charm of the vintage style illustration. This style was even requested me by the United Nations when I worked earlier this year at their stamps collections. For example, the series dedicated to the endangered species. And here is a mix of, again, modern and old-fashioned illustration styles, where a vector illustration created with Adobe Illustrator can be mixed with more realistic and old-fashioned digital paintings. This was a series on modern amphibians' courtship behaviors that was exposed at the Natural History Museum in Genoa in 2024. In the rest of this panel, I will bring you 4 examples of 4 different paleoart pieces, and I will share with you some of the insights of their making of. A paleoart piece as a part of storytelling. It is like a zip file filled with information and emotions. Today we'll see a few examples of how convey different types of information or feelings depending of what is our communicative goal. Whose is this eye that is watching us? It is a 𝗏𝗏 𝗏𝗡 from my work Ancient Gadoufaoua, a painting about the 𝗦𝗏𝗏 formation in Niger. And here we can find some of the scientific material that I used as a reference. Like for example, I did a reconstruction of the 𝗏𝗏 skull, and below there is the bibliography that I used to create the painting. But even if there is a hard scientific core in this painting, my goal was to deliver a more artistic message. The complete title of this painting is Ancient Gadoufaoua Air, because the real protagonist of this painting is air. Yes, 𝗏𝗏 is in the foreground, but everything that we see is closely connected to the wind and the approaching storm. For example, we can see the cichas bowing the wind. We can see the air inflating, the wings of the 𝗦𝗫𝗫𝗃 flying over the river. And there is also a sandstorm gusting in the background, where a group of Tyrannosaurus is approaching the river. This is a work designed for an audience that loves naturalistic illustrations, and it is intended as a decorative piece that evokes emotions in the viewer. It does not convey any particular educational message, although it is of course up to date with the recent studies. And here we have another eye. I must have a thing for eyes. This is the second work I selected for this visual exhibition, Encounter Under the Rain, a life-size portrait of the bust of an adult Gorgosaurus libratus in its environment. As before, here we can see some of the reference material I used, such as this beautiful skull in the top corner right, and the bibliography I used to reconstruct both the main subject and the environment. Like the Gadoufaoua painting from before, the primary goal of this work is not science communication. The goal of this painting is to allow the viewer to establish a connection with the subject. That's why I chose to portray the dinosaur at life size. This was a painting that I created imagining it for a museum that had Gorgosaurus remains in its collection. If we place this life-size print next to these remains, it would allow the viewer to form a bond with the animal and observe it. Observe it not as a museum specimen, not as a bloodthirsty animal or monster it is often depicted in traditional media, but as a simple animal, depicted resting in its natural environment in a calm situation. Here is an example of what I mean. In this mock-up we can see a person, the visitor, observing the artwork next to the skull of the specimen on display. Even if this is a mock-up, we can already imagine the impact on a visitor seeing this combination. So, if there is anyone in the audience who is in contact with a natural history museum that has Gorgosaurus in its collection and might be interested in this work, my contacts information are at the end of the presentation. Here instead we have a submarine eye, another kind of eye, that belongs to 𝗏𝗏𝗏 𝗏𝗏𝗏, the protagonist of the third painting in this exhibition, Trophic Dance. This is a painting depicting a situation that actually occurred and it is documented in the fossil record. An act of predation by 𝗏𝗏𝗏 𝗏𝗏𝗏 on a young Dorudon atrox in the Eocene seas of Egypt. And here we are. Here is the reference material I used along with the bibliography I consulted to create the artwork. You can see the two skulls, one of the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 at the top and one of Dorudon, which I used as a reference. In the bottom right, there is also a map of the Wadi al-Litan site in the Fayoum, Egypt. The goal of this work is clearly science communication. At the Wadi al-Litan site, which in Arabic means the Valley of Whales, a fragment of a young Dorudon atrox skull was found. Dorudon was a basilosaurid roughly the size of a pilot whale, around 6 meters. The skull fragment of this young adult individual, which was probably no longer than a couple of meters, showed marks bite that the science determined were left by the teeth of 𝗏 𝗏 an arcucid the size of a sperm whale that must have been the terror of the Eocene seas. Most likely 37 million years ago, the 𝗏 𝗏 site was a shallow water area, used, perhaps, by Dorudon as a reproductive nursery, given the large number of young individuals found there. It is possible that 𝗏 from time to time raided this nursery, preying on the juveniles. This painting was conceived as a museum mural, but it also works in other science communication contexts, for example, publishing. In fact, it can be found alongside the story in a booklet I published in 2023, which narrates the paleontological facts. The booklet is currently available only in Italian. We couldn't conclude it without another eye, this time for lovers of terrestrial mammals. This is the eye of an 𝗦𝗶𝗺 𝗔𝗰𝗋, taken from a museum mural-sized painting I created in 2022, which depicts the fauna and flora of the Miocene site of Pikermi in Greece. Here we can see a part of the bibliography I used to create this work, along with the skull of 𝗦𝗶𝗺 𝗔𝗰𝗋 that I kept as a reference during the reconstruction of these animals. The goal of this piece is primarily educational, as it was created to serve as the main artwork for a museum exhibition dedicated to the fauna of Pikermi. Pikermi is an extremely important site for understanding the fauna, flora, and the environment of southern Eurasia in the late Miocene. This piece was intended as a visual compendium of the Pikermian ecosystem, allowing the viewer to grasp its main characteristic at a glance. In fact, there are the main groups of animals that help determine the type of environment and vegetation. There are the browsers, such as the giraffe 𝗏 and the Proboscidean 𝗦𝗏𝗏 𝗏𝗏, indicating substantial forest coverage. And there are also the grazers, such as 𝗦𝗏𝗀 𝗀𝗏, suggesting that the forested areas were interspersed with open savanna-like patches. Looking at this panel, we can infer that the top predator of the area was 𝗦𝗶𝗺 𝗔𝗰𝗋, and that maybe it lived in small family groups. This painting also includes seed-dispersing animals, which are very valuable for the environment, such as the primate Mesozoic 𝗦𝗶𝗺, perched on a carob tree, and the tortoise 𝗏 visible in the foreground among the grass. The viewer's eye is guided by the composition so it can move across the painting, from right to left and from left to right, taking a small safari through the Miocene Europe. This is what I meant when I said that a Paleoart piece is like a zip file of knowledge. It can contain a vast amount of information, both about biological composition and inferences about animal behavior, all within a single image that can be understood regardless of the viewer's spoken language. The artwork and the related facts are included in a booklet dedicated to the environment of southern Europe during the Miocene, where we can find in-depth information of the main groups of animals and the plants in the Pikermi biota. This artwork is also the center of some project currently in development. At the moment, the exhibition dedicated to the fauna of Pikermi is being prepared, which is looking for an institution interested in investing in the project. The goal of this exhibition is to discuss ongoing climate changes using the faunal and environmental shift of the late Miocene as an example. On the right, you can see some of the examples of how this artwork has already been used in editorial products and museum exhibitions. And I couldn't conclude without one final gem, to show the versatility that Paleoart can have in terms of style and applications. The style you see here is what I call digital engraving, created by taking inspiration from ancient engravings, while giving them the versatility and the freshness of digital illustration. For this work, I was contacted by a winery of Pikermi to create wine labels featuring the site's fauna. This is what I meant by a paleoartist acting as a visual director. Depending on the context and communicative goals, different styles and modes of expressions can be used. while still maintaining scientific rigor and coherence. In conclusion, let's recap the 4 works I brought to this exhibition and their differences, starting with ancient Gadoufaoua, where the goal is to immerse the viewer, focusing on the sensation depicted. Then we have Encounter Under the Rain, featuring the portrait of Gorgosaurus, aims to create a more intimate connection between the viewer and the fossil organism portrayed. With Trophic Dance, we enter an illustrated chronicle of an event preserved in the fossil record. Finally, with the last work depicting the Pikermi biota, the goal is educational. In a single glance, the viewer can extract a wealth of information that visually summarizes the scientific studies conducted on the ecosystem. So, thank you for your time and attention. I apologize again for not being here in person. I will catch up on the other talks, and I hope my presentation has been inspiring. If you have any question, feel free to write me down. And thanks to Karim, thanks to Darren, and thanks to Steve for the work that you have done. And enjoy the venue. Bye!